A Manifesto for Cyborgs, Science, Technology, and Socialist Feminism in the 1980s by Donna Haraway. An ironic dream of a common language for women in the integrated circuit. This essay is an effort to build an ironic political myth faithful to feminism, socialism, and materialism. Perhaps more faithful as blasphemy is faithful than its reverent worship identification. Blasphemy has always seemed to require taking things very seriously. I know no better stance to adopt from within the secular, religious, evangelical traditions of United States politics, including the politics of socialist feminism. Blasphemy protects one from the moral majority within, while still insisting on the need for community. Blasphemy is not apostasy. Irony is about contradictions that do not resolve into larger wholes, even dialectically, about the tension holding incompatible things together because both or all are necessary and true. Irony is about humor and serious play. It is also a rhetorical strategy and a political method, one I would like to see more honored within socialist feminism. At the center of my ironic faith, my blasphemy, is the image of the cyborg. A cyborg is a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. Social reality is lived social relations, our most important political construction, a world-changing fiction. The international women's movements have constructed women's experience, and has covered this crucial. This experience is fiction of crucial political kind. Literature writes about construction of consciousness and apprehension, oppression, and so impossibility. Cyborg is a matter of fiction and a lived experience that changes what is counted as women's experience in the late 20th century. This is a struggle for life and death, but the boundary between science fiction and social reality is an optical illusion. Contemporary science fiction is full of cyborgs, creatures simultaneously animal and machine, who populate worlds ambiguously natural. Modern medicine also uses cyborgs, metabolism changing within the machine, each conceived as coded devices, in an intimacy and with a power that was not generated in the history of sexuality. Cyborg sex illustrates some of the lovely replicative of ferns and vertebrates, such nice organic galactics and heterosexism. Cyborg replication is unfold from organic. Modern production seems like a dream of cyborg colonization of work, a dream that makes Napier or Taylorism seem idyllic. The modern war is a cyborg war, coded by C to the power of 3I, control, communication, and intelligence. cyborg is our ontology, it gives us politics. The cyborg is a condensed image of both imagination and material reality, the two joint centers structuring any possibility of historical transformation. In the traditions of Western science and politics, the tradition of racist, male-dominant capitalism, the tradition of progress, the tradition of the appropriation of nature as resource for traditions of culture, the tradition of reproduction of the self from the reflections of the other, the relation between organism and machine has reproduction and imagination. This essay is an argument for fusion of boundaries and for responsibility in their construction. It is also an effort to contribute to socialist feminist culture and theory in a postmodernist, non-naturalist mode, and in the utopian tradition of imagining a world without gender, which is perhaps a world without genesis, but maybe also a world without end. The cyborg incarnation is outside salvation history, nor does the cyborg mark time on an edible calendar to kill the terrible cleavage of gender world and beyond utopia, the whole apocalypse. As Zoe Follis argues in her unpublished manuscript on Jacques Lacan and Melanie Klein, the most terrible and perhaps the most monsters in cyborg worlds are embodied in non-edible narratives of different unconscious and a different logic of repression, which we need to understand for our survival. The cyborg is featured in a post-gender world. It has no track with sexuality, symbiosis, unalienated labor, or other seductions to organic wholeness through a final appropriation of all the powers and parts into a higher unity. In a sense, the cyborg has no origin story in the Western sense. The final is also the awful apocalyptic telos of applications of abstract individuation, itself and idolized moral dependency, a man's space. The origin story in the Western humanist sense depends on the myth of original unity, fullness, bliss, represented by the phallic mother from whom all humans must separate, the task of individual development and history, the twin potent myths inscribed most powerfully for us in psychoanalysis and Marxism. Hilary Klein has argued that both Marxism and psychoanalysis, in their concepts of labor and of individuation and gender formation, depend on the plot of original unity out of which difference must be produced and enlisted in a drama of escalating domination of woman/nature. The cyborg skips the step of original unity, of identification with nature in the Western sense. This is its illegitimate promise that might lead us to subversion of its teleology as Star Wars. The cyborg is resolutely committed to partiality, irony, intimacy, and perversity. It is oppositional, utopian, and completely without innocence. No longer structured by the polarity of public and private, the cyborg defines a technological polis based partly on a revolution of social relations in the Oikos household. Nature and culture are reworked. The one can no longer be the resource for appropriation or incorporation by the other. The relationships for forming wholes from parts, including those of polarity and hierarchical domination, are at issue in the cyborg world. The hopes of Frankenstein's monster. The cyborg does not expect its father to save it through i.e., through the fabrication of a heterosexual mate, through its complete whole, a city and cosmos. Community without the edible product. Recognize the Garden of Eden is not made of mud and cannot move returning to dust. Perhaps it is one to see if cyborgs can subvert the apocalypse or return to nuclear dust and the manic compulsion that named the enemy. Cyborgs are not reverent. They do not remember the cosmos. They are wary of holism, but need for connection. They seem to have a natural feel for united front politics without the vanguard party. The main trouble with cyborgs, of course, is that they are the illegitimate offspring of militarism and matriarchal capitalism, not to mention state socialism. But illegitimate offspring are often exceedingly unfaithful to their origins. Their fathers, after all, are inessential. I will return to the science fiction of cyborgs at the end of this essay, but now I want to signal 3 crucial boundary breakdowns that make the following political-fictional, political-scientific analysis possible. By the late 20th century in United States scientific culture, the boundary between human and animal is thoroughly breached. The last beachheads of uniqueness have been polluted, if not turned into amusement parks. Language, tool use, social behavior, mental events, nothing really convincingly settles the separation of human and animal. And many people no longer feel the need of such a separation. Indeed, many branches of feminist culture affirm the pleasure of connection of human and other living creatures. Movements for animal rights are not irrational denials of human uniqueness. They are clear-sighted recognition of connection across the discredited breach of nature and culture. Biology and evolutionary theory over the last 2 centuries have simultaneously produced modern organisms as objects of knowledge and reduced the line between humans and animals to a faint trace, re-etched in ideological struggle or professional disputes between life and social sciences. Within this framework, teaching modern Christian creationism to be fought as a form of child abuse. Biological determinist theology is only one position opened up in scientific culture for arguing the meanings of human animality. There is much room for radical political people to contest for the meanings of the breached boundary. The cyborg appears in myth precisely where the boundary between human and animal is transgressed. Far from signaling a wall off of people from other living beings, cyborgs signal disturbingly and pleasurably tight coupling. Bestiality has a new status in the cycle of marriage exchange. The second leaky distinction is between human, animal, organism, and machine. Pre-cybernetic machines could be haunted. There was always the specter of the ghost in the machine. This dualism structured the dialogue between materialism and idealism that was settled by dialectical progeny, spirit, or history, according to taste. But basically, machines were not self-moving, self-designing, autonomous. They could not achieve man's dream, only mock it. They were not man, an author to himself, but only a caricature of that masculinist reproductive dream. To think they were otherwise was paranoid. Now, we are not so sure. Late 20th century machines have made thoroughly ambiguous the difference between natural and artificial, mind and body, self-developing and externally designed, and many other distinctions that used to apply to organisms and machines. Our machines are disturbingly lively, and we ourselves frighteningly inert. Technological determinism is only one ideological space opened up by the preconceptions of machine and organism as coded texts through which we engage in the play of writing and reading the world. Textualization of everything in post-structuralist, postmodernist theory has been damned by Marxists and socialist feminists for its utopian disregard for living relationships of domination that ground the play of arbitrary reading. It is certainly true that postmodernist strategies, like my cyborg myth, subvert myriad organic wholes, e.g., the poem, the primitive culture, the biological organism. In short, the certainty of what counts as nature, a source of insight and promise of innocence, is undermined, probably fatally. The transcendent authorization of interpretation is lost, and with it, the ontology grounding Western epistemology. But the alternative is not cynicism or faithlessness, i.e., some version of abstract existence, like the accounts of technological determinism destroying man by the machine, or meaningful political action by the text. Who cyborgs will be is a radical question. The answers are a matter of survival. Both chimpanzees and artifacts have politics, so why shouldn't we? The third distinction is a subset of the second. The boundary between physical and non-physical is very imprecise for us. Pop physics books on the consequences of quantum theory and the indeterminacy principle are a kind of popular scientific equivalent to the Harlequin romances as a marker of radical change in American white heterosexuality. They get it wrong, but they are on the right subject. Modern machines are quintessentially microelectronic devices. They are everywhere and they are invisible. Modern machinery is an irreverent, upstart god, marking the Father's ubiquity and spirituality. The silicon chip is the surface for writing. It is etched in molecular scales disturbed only by atomic noise, the ultimate interference from nuclear scores. Writing, power, and technology are old partners in Western stories of the origin of civilization, but miniaturization has changed our experience of mechanism. Miniaturization has turned out to be about power. Small is not so much beautiful as preeminently dangerous, as in cruise missiles. Contrast the TV sets of the 1950s or the news cameras of the 1970s with the TV wristbands or hand-sized video cameras now advertised. Our best machines are made of sunshine. They are all light and clean because they are nothing but signals, electromagnetic waves, a section of the spectrum. And these machines are eminently portable, mobile, a matter of immense human pain in Detroit and Singapore. Floating signifiers moving in pickup trucks across Europe, blocked more effectively by the witch weavings of the displaced and so unnatural Green women, who read the cyborg webs of power very well, than by the militant labor of older masculinist politics, whose natural constituency needs defense jobs. Ultimately, the heart of science is about the realm of greatest boundary confusion, the realm of pure number, pure spirit, C to the power of 3I, cryptography, and the preservation of potent secrets. The new machines are so clean and light. Their engineers are sun worshippers, mediating a new scientific revolution associated with the night dream of post-industrial society. The diseases evoked by these clean machines are no more than the minuscule coding changes of an antigen in the immune system, no more than the experience of stress. The nimble little fingers of Oriental women, the old fascination of little Anglo-Saxon Victorian girls with dollhouses, women's enforced attention to the small take on five dimensions in this world. There might be a cyborg Alice to count of these three dimensions. Ironically, there might be the unnatural cyborg women making chips in Asia and spiral dancing in Santeria, whose constructed unities will guide effective oppositional strategies. So my cyborg myth is about transgressed boundaries, potent fusions, and dangerous possibilities which progressive people might explore as one part of needed political work. One of my premises is that most American socialists and feminists see deepened dualisms of mind and body, animal and machine, idealism and materialism in social practices, symbolic formulations, and physical artifacts associated with high technology and scientific culture. From one-dimensional man to the death of nature, the analytic resources developed by progressives have insisted on the necessary domination of techniques and recalled us to an imagined organic body to integrate our resistance. Another of my premises is that the need for a unity of people trying to resist worldwide intensification of domination has never been more acute. But a slightly perverse shift of perspective might better enable us to contest for meanings, as well as for other forms of power and pleasure in technologically mediated societies. From one perspective, a cyborg world is about the final imposition of a grid of control on the planet, about the final abstraction embodied in a Star Wars apocalypse waged in the name of defense, about the final appropriation of women's bodies in a masculinist orgy of war. From another perspective, a cyborg world might be about lived social and bodily realities in which people are not afraid of the joint kinship with animals and machines, not afraid of permanently partial identities and contradictory standpoints. The political struggle is to see from both perspectives at once, because each reveals both dominations and possibilities unimaginable from the other vantage point. Single vision produces worse illusions than double vision or many-headed monsters. Cyborg unities are monstrous and illegitimate. In our present political circumstances, we could hardly hope for more potent death for resistance and recoupling. I like to imagine LAG, the Livermore Action Group, as a kind of cyborg society dedicated to realistically control laboratories that most fiercely embody and spew out the tools of technological apocalypse, and committed to building a political form that actually manages to hold together witches, engineers, elders, perverts, Christians, mothers, and Leninists long enough to disarm the state. Fission Impossible is the name of the affinity group in my town. Affinity, related not by blood but by choice. The appeal of one chemical nuclear group for another. Avidity. Fractured identities. It has become difficult to name one's feminism by a single adjective, or even to insist in every circumstance upon the noun. Consciousness of exclusion through naming is acute. Identities seem contradictory, partial, and strategic. With a hard-won recognition of their social and historical constitution, gender, race, and class cannot provide the basis for belief in essential unity. There is nothing about being female that naturally binds women. There is not even such a state as being female, itself a highly complex category constructed in contested sexual scientific discourses and other social practices. Gender, race, or class consciousness is an achievement forced on us by the terrible historical experience of the contradictory social realities of patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism. And who counts as us in my own rhetoric? Which identities are available to ground such a potent political myth called us, and what could motivate enlistment in this collectivity? Painful fragmentation among feminists, not to mention among women, along every possible fault line has made the concept of woman elusive, an excuse for the matrix of women's dominations of each other. For me, and for many who share a similar historical location in white, professional middle class, female, radical, North American, mid-adult bodies, the sources of a crisis in political identity are legion. The recent history for much of the U.S. left and U.S. feminism has been a response to this kind of crisis by endless splitting and searches for a new essential unity. But there has also been a growing recognition of another response through coalition, affinity, not identity. Sheila Sandoval, from a consideration of the specific historical moments in the formation of the new political voice called women of color, has a hopeful model of political identity called oppositional consciousness, born of the skills for reading webs of power by those refused stable membership in the social categories of race, sex, or class. Women of color, a name contested at its origins by those whom it would incorporate, as well as a historical consciousness marking systematic breakdowns of all the signs of man in Western traditions, constructs a kind of postmodernist identity out of otherness and difference. This postmodernist identity is fully political, whatever may be said about other possible practices. Sandoval emphasizes the lack of any essential criterion for identifying who is a woman of color. A Chicana or U.S. Black woman has not been a Black person, or is a Chicano. The bottom of a cascade of negative identities, left out of even the privileged oppressed authorial categories called women and blacks, who claim to make the important revolutions. The category woman negated all non-white women. Black negated all black people, as well as all black women. But there was also no she, no singularity, but a sea of differences among U.S. women who have affirmed their historical identity as U.S. women of color. This identity marks out a self-consciously constructed space that cannot affirm the capacity to act on the basis of natural identification, but only on the basis of conscious coalition, of affinity, of political kinship. Unlike the woman of some streams of the white women's movement in the United States, there is no naturalization of the matrix, or at least this is what Sandoval argues is uniquely available through the power of oppositional consciousness. Sandoval's argument has to be seen as one potent formulation for feminists out of the worldwide development anti-colonialist discourse, i.e., discourse dissolving the West and its highest product, the one who is not animal, barbarian, or woman, i.e., man, the author of a cosmos called history. As Orientalism is deconstructed politically and semiotically, the identities of the Occident destabilize, including those of feminists. Sandoval argues that women of color have a chance to build an effective unity that does not replicate the imperializing, totalizing revolutionary subjects of previous Marxisms and feminisms, which had not faced the consequences of the disorderly polyphony emerging from decolonization. Katie King has emphasized the limits of identification and the political, poetic mechanics of identification built into reading the poem, that generative core of cultural feminism. King criticizes the persistent tendency among contemporary feminists from different moments or conversations in feminist practice to taxonomize the women's movement to make one's own political tendencies appear to be the telos of the whole. These taxonomies tend to remake feminist history to appear to be an ideological struggle among coherent types persisting over time, especially those typical units called radical, liberal, feminism. Literally, all other feminisms are either incorporated or marginalized, usually by building an explicit ontology and epistemology. Taxonomies of feminism produce epistemologies to police deviation from official women's experience. And of course, women's culture, like women of color, is consciously created by mechanisms inducing affinity. The rituals of poetry, movement, and certain forms of academic practice have been preeminent. The politics of race and culture in the U.S. women's movements are intimately interwoven. The common achievement of King and Sandoval is learning how to craft a poetic political unity without relying on a logic of appropriation, incorporation, and taxonomic identification. The theoretical and practical struggle against unity through domination or unity through incorporation ironically not only undermines the justifications for patriarchy, colonialism, humanism, positivism, essentialism, scientism, and other unlimited isms, but all claims for an organic or natural standpoint. I think that radical and socialist Marxist feminisms have also undermined their and our own epistemological strategies, and that this is a crucially valuable step in imagining possible unities. I think that radical and socialist Marxist feminisms have also undermined our own epistemological strategies, and that this is a crucially valuable step in imagining possible unities. It remains to be seen whether all epistemologies, as Western political people have known them, fail us in the task to build effective affinities. It is important to note that the effort to construct revolutionary standpoints, epistemologies as achievements of people committed to changing the world, has been part of the process showing the limits of identification. The acid tools of postmodernist theory and the constructive tools of ontological discourse about revolutionary subjects might be seen as ironic allies in dissolving Western selves in the interests of survival. We are excruciatingly conscious of what it means to have a strictly constituted body. But with the loss of innocence in our origin, there is no expulsion from the garden either. Our politics lose the indulgence of guilt with the naivete of innocence. What would another political myth for socialist feminism look like? What kinds of politics could embrace partial, contradictory, permanently enclosed constructions of personal and collective selves and still be faithful, effective, and ironically socialist feminist? I do not know of any other time in history when there was greater need for political unity to confront effectively the dominations of race, gender, sexuality, and class. I also do not know of any other time when the kind of unity we might help build could have been possible. None of us have any longer the symbolic or material capability of dictating the shape of reality to any of them, or at least we cannot claim innocence from practicing such dominations. White women, including socialist feminists, discovered, i.e. were forced, kicking and screaming to notice, the non-innocence of the category woman. That consciousness changes the geography of all previous categories. It denatures them as heat denatures a fragile protein. Cyborg feminists have to argue that we do not want any more natural matrix of unity and that no construction is whole. Innocence and the corollary innocence of victimhood as the only ground for insight have done enough damage. But the constructed revolutionary subject must give late 20th century people pause as well. In the frame of identities and the reflexive strategies for constructing them, the possibility opens up for weaving something other than a shroud for the day after the apocalypse that so prophetically ends Salvation history. Both Marxist socialist feminisms and other radical feminisms have simultaneously naturalized and denatured the category of woman and consciousness of the social lives of women. Perhaps the schematic caricature can highlight both kinds of moves. Marxian socialism is rooted in an analysis of wage labor which reveals class structure. The consequence of the wage relationship is systematic alienation, as the worker is disassociated from his, product. Abstraction and illusion rule in knowledge, domination rules in practice. Labor is a preeminently privileged category, enabling the Marxists to overcome illusion and find that point of view which is necessary for changing the world. Labor is a humanizing activity that makes man. Labor is an ontological category permitting the knowledge of the subject, and so the knowledge of subjugation and alienation. In faithful affiliation, Socialist feminism advanced by allying itself with the basic analytic strategies of Marxism. The main achievement of both Marxist feminists and socialist feminists was to expand the category of labor to accommodate what some women did, even when the wage relation was subordinated to a more comprehensive view of labor under capitalist patriarchy. In particular, women's labor in the household and women's activity as mothers generally, i.e. reproduction in the socialist feminist sense, entered theory on the authority of analogy to the Marxian concept of labor. In particular, women's labor in the household and women's activity as mothers generally, i.e. reproduction in the socialist feminist sense, entered theory on the authority of analogy to the Marxian concept of labor. The unity of women here rests on an epistemology based on the ontological structure of labor. Marxist socialist feminism does not naturalize unity. It is a possible achievement based on a possible standpoint rooted in social relations. The essentializing move is in the ontological structure of labor or of its analog, women's activity. The inheritance of Marxian humanism, with its preeminently Western self, is a difficulty for me. The contribution from these formulations has been the emphasis on the daily responsibility of real women to build unities rather than to naturalize them. Catherine McKinnon's version of radical feminism is itself a caricature of the appropriating, incorporating, totalizing tendencies of Western theory of identity grounding action. It is factually and politically wrong to assimilate all of the diverse moments or conversations in recent women's politics named radical feminism to McKinnon's version. But the teleological logic of her argument shows how an epistemology and an ontology, including their negations, erase or police difference. Only one of the effects of McKinnon's theory is a rewriting of the history of the polymorphous field called radical feminism. The main effect is the production of a theory of experience of women's identity that is a kind of apocalypse for all revolutionary standpoints. That is, the totalization built into this tale of radical feminism achieves its end, the unity of women, by enforcing the experience of and testimony to radical non-being. As to the Marxist socialist feminist, consciousness is an achievement, not a natural fact, and McKinnon's theory eliminates some of the difficulties built into humanist revolutionary subjects, but at the cost of radical reductionism. McKinnon argues that radical feminism necessarily adopted a different analytical strategy from Marxism, looking first not at the structure of class, but at the structure of sex and gender, and its generative relationship, men's constitution and appropriation of women sexually. Ironically, McKinnon's ontology constructs a non-subject, a non-being. Another's desire, not the self's labor, is the origin of woman. She therefore develops a theory of consciousness that enforces what can count as women's experience, anything that names sexual violation, indeed, sex itself, as far as women can be concerned. Feminist practices the construction of this form of consciousness, i.e., the self-knowledge of a self who is. Perversely, sexual appropriation in this sexual feminism still has the epistemological status of labor, i.e., from which else is able to contribute to changing the world must flow. But sexual objectification, not alienation, is the consequence of the structure of sex and gender. In the realm of knowledge, the result of sexual objectification is illusion and abstraction. However, a woman is not simply alienated from her product, but in a deep sense does not exist as a subject, or even potential subject, since she owes her existence as a woman to sexual appropriation. To be constituted by another's desire is not the same thing as to be alienated in the violent separation of the laborer from his product. McKinnon's radical theory of experience is totalizing in the extreme. It does not so much marginalize as obliterate the authority of any other woman in political speech and action. It is a totalization producing what Western patriarchy itself succeeded in doing. Feminists' consciousness of the non-existence of women, except as products of men's desire. I think McKinnon correctly argues that no Marxian version of identity can firmly ground women's unity. But in solving the problem of the contradictions of any Western revolutionary subject for feminist purposes, he develops an even more authoritarian doctrine of experience. If my complaint about socialist Marxian standpoints is their unintended erasure of polyvocal, unassimilatable, radical difference made visible in anti-colonial discourse and practice, McKinnon's intentional erasure of all difference through the device of the essential non-existence of women is not reassuring. In my taxonomy, which, like any taxonomy, is a reinscription of history, radical feminism connects all of the activities of women named by socialist feminists as forms of labor only if the activity can somehow be sexualized. Reproduction had different tones of meaning for the two tendencies, one rooted in labor, one in sex, both calling the consequences of domination and ignorance of social and personal reality false consciousness. Beyond either the difficulties or the contributions in the argument of any one author, neither Marxist nor radical feminist points of view have tended to embrace the status of a partial explanation. Both are regularly constituted as totalities. Western explanation has demanded as much. How else could the Western author incorporate its others? Each tried to annex other forms of domination by expanding its basic categories through analogy, simple listing, or addition. Embarrassed silence about race among white radical and socialist feminists was one major, devastating political consequence. Historical and polyvocality disappear into political taxonomies that try to establish genealogies. There is no structural room for race, or for much else, in theory claiming to reveal the construction of the category woman and social group women as a unified or totalizable whole. The structure of my caricature looks like this. Socialist feminism, structure of class, wage labor, alienation, labor by analogy reproduction, by extension sex, by addition race. Radical feminism, structure of gender, sexual appropriation, objectification, sex, by analogy labor, by extension reproduction, by addition race. In another context, the French theorist Julia Kristeva claimed women appeared as a historical group after World War II, along with groups like youth. Their dates are doubtful, but we are now accustomed to remembering that as objects of knowledge and as historical actors, race did not always exist, class has a historical genesis, and homosexuals are quite junior. It is no accident that the symbolic system of the family of man, and so the essence of woman, breaks up at the same moment that networks of connection among people on the planet are unprecedentedly multiple, pregnant, and complex. Advanced capitalism is inadequate to convey the structure of this historical moment. In the Western sense, the end of man is at stake. It is no accident that woman disintegrates into women in our time. Perhaps socialist feminists were not substantially guilty of producing a essentialist theory that suppressed women's particularity and contradictory interests. I think we have been, at least through unreflective participation in the logics, languages, and practices of white humanism, and through searching for a single ground of domination to secure our revolutionary voice. Now, we have less excuse. But in the consciousness of our failures, we risk lapsing into boundless difference and giving up on the confusing task of making partial, real connection. Some differences are playful, some are poles of world historical systems of domination. Epistemology is about knowing the difference. The informatics of domination. In this attempt at epistemological and political position, I would like to sketch a picture of possible unity, a picture embedded in socialist and feminist principles of design. The frame for my sketch is set by the extent and importance of rearrangements in worldwide social relations tied to science and technology. I argue for a politics rooted in claims about fundamental changes in the nature of class, race, and gender, in an emerging system of world order analogous in its novelty and scope to that created by industrial capitalism. We are living through a movement from an organic industrial society to a polymorphous information system, from all work to all play, a deadly game. Simultaneously material and ideological, the dichotomies may be expressed in the following chart of transitions from the comfortable old hierarchical dominations to the scary new networks I have called informatics of domination. Representation to simulation, bourgeois novel realism to science fiction postmodernism, organism to biotic component, depth, integrity to surface, boundary, heat to noise, biology as clinical practice to biology as inscription, physiology to communications engineering, small group to subsystem, perfection to optimization, eugenics to population control, decadence, magic mountain to obsolescence, future shock, hygiene to stress management, microbiology, tuberculosis to immunology, AIDS, organic division of labor to ergonomics, cybernetics of labor, functional specialization to modular construction, reproduction to replication, organic sex role specialization to optimal genetic strategies, biological determinism to evolutionary inertia constraints, community ecology to ecosystem, racial chain of being to neo-imperialism, United States humanism, scientific management in home or factory to global factory, electronic cottage, family market factory to women in the integrated circuit, family wage to comparable worth, public and private to cyborg citizenship, nature and culture to fields of difference, cooperation to communications enhancement, Freud to Lacan, sex to genetic engineering, labor to robotics, mind to artificial intelligence, World War II to Star Wars, white capitalist patriarchy to informatics of domination. This list suggests several interesting things. First, the objects on the right-hand side cannot be coded as natural, a realization that subverts naturalist coding for the left-hand side as well. We cannot go back ideologically or materially. It's not just that God is dead, so is the goddess. In relation to objects like biotic components, one must think not in terms of essential properties, but in terms of strategies of design, boundary constraints, rates of flows, systems logics, costs of lowering constraints. Sexual reproduction is one kind of reproductive strategy among many, with costs and benefits as a function of the system environment. Ideologies of sexual reproduction can no longer reasonably call on the notions of sex and sex role as organic aspects in natural objects like organisms and families. Such reasoning will be unmasked as irrational, and ironically, corporate executives reading Playboy and anti-porn radical feminists will make strange bedfellows and jointly unmasking the irrationalism. Likewise for race, ideologies about human diversity have to be formulated in terms of frequencies of parameters, like blood groups or intelligence scores. It is irrational to invoke concepts like primitive and civilized. For liberals and radicals, the search for integrated social systems gives way to a new practice called experimental ethnography, in which an organic object dissipates in attention to the play of writing. At the level of ideology, we see translations of racism and colonialism into languages of development and underdevelopment, rates and constraints of modernization. Any objects or persons can be reasonably thought of in terms of disassembly and reassembly. No natural architectures constrain system design. The financial districts in all of the world's cities, as well as export processing and free trade zones, proclaim this elementary fact of late capitalism. The entire universe of objects that can be known scientifically must be formulated as problems in communications engineering for the managers, or theories of the text for those who would resist. Both are cyborg symbiologies. One should expect control strategies to concentrate on boundary conditions and interfaces, on rates of flow across boundaries, and not on the integrity of natural objects. Integrity, or sincerity, of the Western itself gives way to design procedures and expert systems. For example, control strategies applied to women's capacities to give birth to new human beings will be developed in the languages of population control and maximization of goal achievement for individual decision makers. Control strategies will be formulated in terms of rates, costs of constraints, degrees of freedom. Human beings, like any other component or subsystem, must be localized in a system architecture whose basic modes of operation are probabilistic, statistical. No objects, spaces, or bodies are sacred in themselves. Any component can be interfaced with any other if the proper standard, the proper code, can be constructed for processing signals in common language. Exchange in this world transcends the universal translation affected by capitalist markets that Marx analyzed so well. The privileged pathology affecting all kinds of components in this universe is stress, communications breakdown. The cyborg is not subject to Foucault's biopolitics. The cyborg simulates politics, a much more potent field of operations. This kind of analysis of scientific and cultural objects of knowledge which have appeared historically since World War II prepares us to notice some important inadequacies in feminist analysis, which has proceeded as if the organic, hierarchical dualisms ordering discourse in the West since Aristotle still ruled. They have been cannibalized, or, as Zoe Sophia Zoophilus might put it, they have been techno-digested. The dichotomies between mind and body, animal and human, organism and machine, public and private, nature and culture, men and women, primitive and civilized, are all in question ideologically. The actual situation of women is their integration and exploitation into a world system of production and reproduction and communication called informatics of domination. The home, workplace, market, public arena, body itself, all be dispersed and interfaced in nearly infinite, amorphous ways, with large consequences for one another. Consequences themselves are very different for people, but oppositional international difficult to imagine and essential for survival. One important route for reconstructing feminist politics is through theory and practice addressed to the social relations of science and technology, including crucially the systems of myth and meanings structuring our imaginations. The cyborg is a kind of disassembled and reassembled postmodern collective and personal self. This is the self the feminists must code. Communications technologies and biotechnologies are the crucial tools recrafting our bodies. These tools embody and enforce new social relations for women worldwide. Technologies and scientific discourses can be partially understood as formalizations, i.e., as frozen moments, of the fluid social interactions constituting them, but they should also be viewed as instruments for enforcing meaning. The boundary is permeable between tool and myth, instrument and concept, historical systems of social relations, and historical anatomies of possible bodies, including objects of knowledge. Indeed, myth and tool mutually constitute each other. Furthermore, communication sciences and modern biologies are constructed by a common move, the translation of the world to a problem of coding, a search for a common language in which all resistance to instrumental control disappears, and all heterogeny can be submitted to disassembly, reassembly, investment, and exchange. In communication science, the translation of the world into a problem in coding can be illustrated by looking at cybernetic, feedback-controlled, systems theories applied to telephone technology, computer design, business deployment, or database construction and maintenance. In each case, solution to the key questions rests on a theory of language and control. The key operation is determining the rates, directions, and probabilities of flow of a quantity called information. The world is subdivided by boundaries differentially permeable to information. Information is just that kind of quantifiable element, unit, basis of unity, which allows universal translation, and so unhindered instrumental power, called effective communication. The biggest threat to such power is interruption of communication. Any system breakdown is a function of stress. The fundamentals of this technology can be condensed into the metaphor C to the power of 3I, command, control, communication, intelligence, the military symbol for its operations theory. In modern biology, the translation of the world into a problem in coding can be illustrated by molecular genetics, ecology, socio-biological evolutionary theory, and immunobiology. The organization has been translated into problems of genetic coding and readout. Biotechnology, a writing technology, informs research broadly. In a sense, organisms have ceased to exist as objects of knowledge, giving way to biotic components, i.e., special kinds of information processing devices. The analogous moves in ecology could be examined by probing the history and utility of the concept of the ecosystem. Immunobiology and associated medical practices are rich exemplars of the privilege of coding and recognition systems as an objects of knowledge, as constructions of bodily reality for us. Biology is here a kind of photography. Research is necessarily a kind of intelligence activities. Ironies abound. A stress system goes awry. Its communications processes break down. It fails to recognize the difference between self and other. Human babies with baboon hearts evoke national ethical perplexity for animal rights activists, at least as much for guardians of human purity. Gay men, Haitian immigrants, and intravenous drug users are the privileged victims of an awful immune system disease that Marx inscribes in the body, confusion of boundaries and moral pollution. But these excursions into communication, science, and biology have been at a verified level. There is a mundane, largely economic reality to support my claim that these sciences and technologies indicate fundamental transformations in the structure of the world for us. Communications technologies depend on electronics. Modern states, multinational corporations, military power, welfare state apparatuses, satellite systems, political processes, fabrications of our imaginations, labor control systems, medical constructions of our bodies, commercial pornography, the international division of labor, and religious evangelism depend intimately upon electronics. Microelectronics is the technical basis of simulacra, i.e., of copies without the originals. Microelectronics mediates the translations of labor into robotics and word processing, sex into genetic engineering and reproductive technologies, and mind into artificial intelligence and decision procedures. The new biotechnologies concern more than human reproduction. Biology as a powerful engineering science for redesigning materials and processes has revolutionary implications for industry, perhaps most obvious today in areas of fermentation, agriculture, and energy. Communication sciences and biology are constructions of natural, technical objects of knowledge in which the difference between machine and organism is thoroughly blurred. Mind, body, and tool are on very intimate terms. The multinational material organization of the production and reproduction of daily life and the symbolic organization of the production and reproduction of culture and imagination seem equally implicated. The boundary maintaining images of base and superstructure, public and private, or material and ideal, never seem more feeble. I have used Rachel Grossman's image of women in the integrated circuit to name the situation of women in a world so intimately restructured through the reciprocal relations of science and technology. I use the odd circumlocution, the social relations of science and technology, to indicate that we are not dealing with technological determinism, but with a historical system depending upon structured relations among people. The phrase should also indicate that science and technology provide fresh sources of power, that we need fresh sources of analysis and political action. Some of the rearrangements of race, sex, and class rooted in high-tech facilitate social relations can make socialist feminism more relevant to effective politics. The homework economy. The new industrial revolution is producing a new worldwide working class. The extreme mobility of capital and the emerging international division of labor are intertwined with the emergence of new collectivities and the beginning of familiar groupings. These developments are neither race nor gender neutral. White men in advanced industrial societies have become newly vulnerable to permanent job loss, and women are not disappearing from the job roles at the same rates as men. It is not simply that women in third world countries are the preferred labor force for the science-based multinationals in the export processing sectors, particularly in electronics. The picture is more systematic and involves reproduction, sexuality, culture, consumption, and production. In the prototypical Silicon Valley, many women's lives have been structured around employment in electronics-dependent jobs, and their intimate realities include serial heterosexual monogamy, negotiating childcare, distance from extended kin or most other forms of traditional community, a high likelihood of loneliness, and extreme economic vulnerability as they age. The ethnic and racial diversity of women in Silicon Valley structures a microcosm of conflicting differences in culture, family, religion, education, language. Richard Gordon has called this new situation the homework economy. Although he includes the phenomenon of literal homework emerging in connection with electronics assembly, Gordon intends a homework economy to name a restructuring of work that broadly has the characteristics formerly ascribed to female jobs, jobs literally done only by women. Work is being redefined as both literally female and feminized, whether performed by men or women. To be feminized means to be made extremely vulnerable, able to be disassembled, assembled, exploited as a reserved labor force, seen less as workers and as servers, subjected to time arrangements on and off the paid job that make a mockery of a limited workday, leading an existence that always borders on being obscene, out of place, and reducible to sex. Deskilling is an old strategy newly applicable to formerly privileged workers. However, the homework economy does not refer only to large-scale deskilling, nor does it deny that new areas of high skill are emerging, even for women and men previously excluded from skilled employment. Rather, the concept indicates that factory, home, and market are integrated on a new scale, and that the places of women are crucial and need to be analyzed for differences among women and for meaningful relations between men and women in various circumstances. Rather, the concept indicates that factory, home, and market are integrated on a new scale, and that the places of women are crucial and need to be analyzed for differences among women and for meaningful relations between men and women in various situations. The homework economy as a world capitalist organizational structure is made possible by, not caused by, the new technologies. The success of the attack on relatively privileged, mostly white, men's unionized jobs is tied to the power of the new communications technologies to integrate and control labor despite extensive dispersion and decentralization. The consequences of the new technology are felt by women both in the loss of the family, male, job wage, if they ever had access to this white privilege, and in the character of their own jobs, which are becoming capital intensive, i.e. office work and nursing. The new economic and technological arrangements are also related to the collapsing welfare state and the intensification of demands on women to sustain daily life for themselves as well as for men, children, and old people. The feminization of poverty, generated by dismantling the welfare state, by the homework economy where stable jobs become the exception, and sustained by the expectation that women's wage will not be matched by male income for the support of children, has become an urgent focus. The causes of various women-headed households are a function of class or sexuality, but their increasing generality is a ground for coalitions of women on many issues. That women regularly sustain daily life partially as a function of their enforced status as mothers is fairly new. The kind of integration with the overall capitalist and progressively war-based economy is new. The particular pressure, for example, on U.S. black women who have achieved an escape from barely paid domestic service and who now hold clerical and similar jobs in large numbers, has large implications for continued enforced black poverty with employment. Teenage women in industrializing areas of the Third World increasingly find themselves the sole or major source of a cash wage for their family, while access to land is ever more problematic. These developments must have major consequences in the psychodynamics and politics of gender and race. Within the framework of three major stages of capitalism, commercial and early industrial, monopoly, multinational, tied to nationalism, imperialism, and multinationalism, and related to Jameson's three dominant aesthetic periods of realism, modernism, and postmodernism, I would argue that specific forms of family dialectically relate to forms of capital and to its political and cultural concomitants. Although lived problematically and unequally, ideal forms of these families might be schematized as 1. The patriarchal nuclear family, structured by the dichotomy between public and private, and accompanied by the white bourgeois ideology of separate spheres in 19th century Anglo-American bourgeois feminism. 2. The modern family mediated or enforced by the welfare state and institutions like the family wage with the flowering of afeminist heterosexual ideologies, including their radical versions represented in Greenwich Village around World War I. And 3. The family of the homework economy, with its oxymoronic structure of women-headed households and its explosion of feminisms and the paradoxical intensification and erosion of gender itself. This is the context in which the projections for worldwide structural unemployment stemming from the new technologies are part of the picture of the homework economy. As robotics and related technologies put men out of work in developed countries and exacerbate failure to generate male jobs in third world development, and as the automated office becomes the rule even in labor surplus countries, the feminization of work intensifies. Black women in the United States have long known what it looks like to face the structural underemployment, feminization, of black men, as well as their own highly vulnerable position in the wage economy. It is no longer a secret that sexuality, reproduction, family, and community life are interwoven with this economic structure in myriad ways, which also differentiate the situations of white and black women. Many more women and men will contend with similar situations, which will make cross-gender and race alliances on issues of basic life support, with or without jobs, necessary, not just nice. The new technologies also have a profound effect on hunger and on food production for subsistence worldwide. Ray Lesser-Blumberg estimates that women produce about 50% of the world's subsistence food. Women are excluded generally from benefiting from the increased high-tech commodification of food and energy crops. Their days are made more arduous because their responsibilities to provide food do not diminish, and their reproductive situations are made more complex. Green Revolution technologies interact with other high-tech industrial production to alter gender divisions of labor and differential gender migration patterns. The new technologies seem deeply involved in the forms of privatization that Ross Pachesky has analyzed, in which militarization, right-wing family ideologies and policies, and intensified definitions of corporate property as private synergistically interact. The new communications technologies are fundamental to the eradication of public life for everyone. This facilitates the mushrooming of a permanent high-tech military establishment at the cultural and economic expense of most people, but especially of women. Technologies like video games and highly miniaturized television seem crucial for the bottom of private life. Video games is heavily oriented to individual competition and extraterrestrial warfare. High-tech, gendered imaginations are produced here, imaginations that can contemplate destruction of the planet and a sci-fi escape from its consequences. More than our imaginations of militarized and the other reality of electronic and nuclear warfare are unescapable. The new technologies affect the social relations of both sexuality and reproduction, and not always in the same ways. The close ties of sexuality and instrumentality, of use of the body as a kind of private satisfaction and utility maximizing machine, are described nicely in sociobiological origin stories that stress a genetic calculus and explain the inevitable dialectic of domination of male and female gender roles. These sociobiological stories depend on a high-tech view of the body as a bionic component or cybernetic communication system. Among the many transformations of reproductive situations is the medical one, where women's bodies have boundaries newly permeable to both visualization and intervention. Of course, who controls the interpretations of bodily boundaries in medical hermeneutics is a major feminist issue. The speculum serves an icon of women's claiming their bodies in the 1970s. That handcraft tool is inadequate to express our needed body politics and the negotiation of reality and the practices of cyborg reproduction. Self-help is not enough. The technologies of visualization recall the important cultural practice of hunting with the camera and the deeply predatory nature of the photographic consciousness. Sex, sexuality, and reproduction are central actors in high-tech systems structuring our imaginations of personal and social possibility. Another critical aspect of the social relations of the new technology is the reformulation of expectations, culture, and reproduction for the large scientific and technical workforce. A major social and political danger is the formation of a strongly bimodal social structure, with the masses of women and men of all ethnic groups, but especially people of color, confined to a homework economy, illiteracy of several varieties, and general redundancy and impotence, controlled by high-tech repressive apparatuses ranging from entertainment to surveillance and disappearance. An adequate socialist feminist politics should address women in the privileged occupational categories, and particularly in the production of science and technology that constructs scientific, technical discourses, processes, and objects. This issue is only one aspect of inquiry into the possibility of a feminist science, but it is important. What kind of constitutive role in the production of knowledge, imagination, and practice can new groups doing science have? How can these groups be allied with progressive social and political movements? What kind of political accountability can be constructed to tie women together across the scientific technical hierarchy separating us? Might there be ways of developing feminist science, technology, politics in alliance with anti-military science facility conversion action groups? Many scientific and technical workers in Silicon Valley, the high-tech cowboys included, do not want to work on military science. Can these personal preferences and cultural tendencies be welded into progressive politics among this professional middle class, in which women, including women of color, are coming to be fairly numerous? Women in the integrated circuit. Let me summarize the picture of women's historical locations in advanced industrial societies, as these positions have been restructured partially through the social relations of science and technology. If it was ever possible ideologically to characterize women's lives by the distinctions of public and private domains, suggested by images of the division of working-class life into factory and home, of bourgeois life into market and home, and of gender existence into personal and political realms, it is now a totally misleading ideology, even to show how both terms of these dichotomies construct each other in practice and in theory. I prefer a network ideological image, suggesting the profusion of spaces and identities, and the permeability of boundaries in the personal body and in the body politic. Networking is both a feminist practice and a multinational corporate strategy. Leaving is for oppositional cyborgs. The only way to characterize informatics of domination is as a massive intensification of insecurity and cultural impoverishment, with common failure of subsistence networks for the most vulnerable. Since much of this picture interweaves with the social relations of science and technology, the urgency of a socialist feminist politics addressed to science and technology is plain. There is much now being done, and the grounds for political work are rich. For example, the efforts to develop forms of collective struggle for women in paid work, like SEIU's District 925, should be a high priority for all of us. These efforts are profoundly tied to technical restructuring of labor processes and reformations of working classes. These efforts also are providing understanding of a more comprehensive kind of labor organization, involving community, sexuality, and family issues never privileged in the largely white male industrial unions. The structural rearrangements related to the social relations of science and technology evoke strong ambivalence, but it is not necessary to be ultimately depressed by the implications of late 20th century women's relation to all aspects of work, culture, production of knowledge, sexuality, and reproduction. For excellent reasons, most Marxisms see domination best and have trouble understanding what can only look like false consciousness and people's complicity in their own domination in late capitalism. It is crucial to remember that what is lost, perhaps especially from women's point of view, is often virulent forms of oppression, nostalgically naturalized in the face of current violation. Ambivalence towards the disrupted unities mediated by high-tech culture requires not sorting consciousness into categories of clear-sighted critique grounded in solid political epistemology versus manipulated false consciousness, but subtle understanding of emerging pleasures, experiences, and powers with serious potential for changing the rules of the game. There are grounds for hope in the emerging bases for new kinds of unity across race, gender, and class, as these elementary units of socialist feminist policies themselves suffer protein transformations. Intensifications of hardship experienced worldwide in connection with the social relations of science and technology are clear. series of experiences. Present efforts, Marxist, psychoanalytic, feminist, anthropological, to clarify even our experience are rudimentary. I am conscious of the odd perspective provided by my historical position. A PhD in biology for an Irish Catholic girl would be possible by Sputnik's impact on U.S. national science education policy. I have a body and mind as much constructed by the post-World War II arms race and Cold War as by the women's movements. There are more grounds for hope by focusing on the contradictory effects of politics designed to produce oil and marine technocrats, which as well produce large numbers of dissidents, rather than by focusing on the present defeats. Like all traits for a perfectly true language, a perfectly faithful naming of experience is a totalizing and imperialist one. In that sense, dialectics too is a dream language, longing to resolve contradictions. Perhaps, ironically, we can learn from our fusions with animals and machines how to not command the embodiment of Western logos. From the point of view of pleasure in these potent fusions, made inevitable by the social relations of science and technology, there might indeed be a feminist science. Cyborgs, political imagery. What to conclude with the myth of anonymity and doctrines which might inform the 20th century critical imaginations. I am indebted in this story to writers like Joanne Russ, Samuel R. John Murray, James exploring what it means to be embodied in archetype worlds. Their theorists are cyborgs. Exploring conceptions of bodily boundaries and social order, anthropologists Mary English and credited feminist consciousness about how fundamental body imagery is to worldview, and so to political language. For all differences, know how to write the body, how to weave eroticism, cosmology, and politics from imagery of embodiment, and, especially for women, imagery of fragmentation and constitution of bodies. They would simply bewilder anyone not preoccupied with machines and consciousness or capitalism. In that sense, they are part of the cyberpunk world. But there are also riches for feminists in explicitly embracing the possibilities inherent in the breakdown of clean distinction between organism and machine. It is a simultaneous breakdowns and cracks the matrices of domination and asymmetric possibilities. What might be learned from personal, political, technological evolution? I will look briefly into groups of texts for their insight into the construction of a potentially helpful subject, constructions of women of color, and science fiction. Earlier,